From the beginning of this coronavirus crisis, the obvious parallels to the climate crisis have just been impossible to ignore. I keep thinking about them, particularly as the pandemic plays out like an intensely sped up acute version of the climate crisis. The same warnings, the same disinformation and know-nothingness, the same tragic consequences, the same failure to act. Two aspects in particular have been haunting me. One is the invisibility of the problem, in a very literal sense. The president has even taken to calling the virus the invisible enemy, which is a hacky bit of propaganda, but based on a kernel of truth. We can't see the coronavirus, like we can't see the carbon in the air. And it's hard to mobilize people around things you can't see. In the case of both the coronavirus and carbon pollution, the absence of spectacle is an obstacle to rallying people. Second thing that's so maddening is that both the climate crisis and a global pandemic did not come out of nowhere. They're not unlikely things that might happen in the future we should plan for. No, according to experts, they're certainties. Here's Bill Gates back in 2015.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. But we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
Like Bill Gates, everyone who knows anything about global health and virology and transmission has been screaming for years about exactly this moment we're in, that it's not if, it's when. And that is also exactly what climate experts have been saying. And they've been called into question, and they've been ignored, and they've been bullied, but they're saying the exact same thing as health experts did about a pandemic. It's coming. And yet here we are standing on the tracks, watching the train barrel towards us and refusing to get out of the way. So I want to talk to a writer who's written about both of these issues, David Wallace Wells, deputy editor and climate columnist for New York Magazine. His latest book was about the climate crisis. Now he's covering the coronavirus pandemic basically full time, and he joins me now. And David, I wonder how much you've been thinking about these parallels.
They're totally hard to avoid, as you point out, and they're a lot more than the ones you just named, although those are maybe the most obvious ones. You know, the truth is the lessons of the coronavirus and the climate crisis are quite similar, too, in the sense that they remind us that we don't live outside of nature, no matter where we are, no matter who we are, no matter what country we live in or how rich we are. We still live subject to the laws of nature and occasionally subject to its brutality. And they also teach us that all of these crises of this scale, are much better when we get a handle on them really early. Studies out of China show that if they had acted 3 weeks earlier, they could have avoided 95% of all of the spread of coronavirus through the country, possibly preventing its spread throughout the world. And a new bit of research this week shows that in New York, if we had taken action 2 weeks earlier, we could have prevented 90% of all deaths. They also open up the coronavirus opens up a whole new spectrum of political possibility that a lot of climate activists are, I think, quite excited about for some good reasons and for some complicated reasons. But the truth is, when you look out at the planet right now, it's hard not to be moved by the expression of global solidarity and fellow feeling that is demonstrated by a literally hemisphere-wide quarantine that is being engaged in willingly by billions of people, in part out of concern for their own health, but also out of concern for the health of those around them. And considering that's really the ultimate project and challenge facing us with climate change, how can we make everybody care more about our collective fate? You can look at this incredible tragedy and horror with some hope. The question is whether we can sustain that kind of feeling through a year or more of quite exhausting struggle, expensive public spending, and all of the pain and suffering that we're going to be witnessing, and come out on the other side still with some political capital and some literal capital to make the kind of investments in green infrastructure and power that we need to.
Well, that point about international solidarity, I think, is a really important one, because it's something about the climate movement I always find very inspiring and moving. You know, on days of these sort of international global climate actions, you'll see, like, here are school children in Nigeria, and here are activists in Pakistan, and here are folks in Seoul, South Korea, and here are people in Moscow, and here are people in New York City. And it's like, right, we all got the same climate. we all got the same thing we got to deal with. And you're seeing that in this pandemic, the same sort of moving feeling when you see healthcare workers, you see nurses, or you see people banging on pots and pans in all these countries around the world, very distant places, very different people in very different situations. And again, the thing we have to beat is the same thing, and we all have to work together to beat it. And in that way, this period also feels a bit like a test, right? Like the level of global coordination in a short acute period where there is some political capital because it's so pressing, as a kind of dry run for what we need to do at a bigger scale afterwards.
And we've accomplished, honestly, so much. I mean, we're in many countries of the world, I would say even most countries of the world, we've failed to take seriously the coronavirus crisis at the speed that we needed to. And yet, just in the space of just a few months, we've engineered as you say, a kind of coordinated, although not literally coordinated, global response in which all of the nations of the Northern Hemisphere and many in the global South have basically upended all forms of life, all economic activity, all social activity in their countries for the sake of self-protection. It's amazing all of the things that we used to take for granted as permanent, unmovable features of modern life, the way that the economy worked, the limited ways that our government could help and move quickly to protect us. All of these things that we took for granted as unchangeable have been proven to be quite changeable in just the time span of a few months when we recognize just how big the crisis that we're facing really is. We haven't yet gotten there with climate change, in part because it's still, despite those inspiring marches, just a small group of people who really believe that this crisis is as urgent as the scientists tell us it is. And we need many more people to feel that way. With COVID, almost everyone is as scared as they possibly could be. And as a result, we're seeing, in certain ways, top down, but in other ways, voluntary efforts to basically change how we live on the planet, on a dime and in quite dramatic ways, which, honestly, I find kind of breathtaking.
That's a really great point, right? The suspension of normalcy and the speed with which it's happened and the sort of horizon of possibility, which is both sort of devastating and brutal because people are losing their jobs and people are going to food banks and people are sick and all that. But also the idea that you can coordinate a remarkable amount. I mean, half the world's population almost on a dime, in a sense, right? In a few weeks, you have half the world's population suddenly abruptly ending every single daily ritual and daily life as normalcy, and also the political possibilities. I mean, we should note, there's the sort of, you have the way that CO2 goes up, the way that coronavirus spreads through a population, like those two graphs which we have, both look unnervingly similar and both sort of create this kind of urgency to act quickly. But there's also the fact that the kind of political frontier of the possible, how are we going to pay for it? This question that haunted the questions of the Green New Deal. Now it's like 2.2 trillion out the door in a few weeks.
Yeah, a few months ago, if you had asked the average American, would the country be willing to go into a total economic shutdown, reduce its economic output by as much as 30%, impose 30% unemployment on itself in order to save 1% to 2% of the population? Most Americans would have told you that was impossible. It would have been an indictment of the country that they did think it was impossible, but they would have told you that it was really hard to imagine. And now here we are just in the space of a few months, and we've done exactly that. And not only that, we've seen, Republican senators proposing something like UBI. We've seen talk about the government claiming some ownership stake in airlines in exchange for bailouts. These are things that used to be so far outside the Overton window of political possibility that nobody ever talked about it as even imaginable. And now they're very much at the center of our political conversation. We need to take that expanded horizon and apply it to climate change because we need many more things to happen that are enclosed within our existing sense of what's possible. We need to expand that horizon on climate as aggressively as we have with COVID-19.